What's up, everybody? Welcome back to the channel. Make sure you guys hit that like button and please subscribe and share this video with all your book loving friends. You guys can check out the different playlists that we've kind of been curating over the last couple of months. Hope you guys have been enjoying the shorts. Today we're back for a more of a longer style video, which are the ones that I prefer, but I do like the shorts as well. So we are going to be doing a quick analysis of Ethan Frome. I don't know how quick it's going to be. Ethan Frome by Edith Wharton. This book takes place in Starkfield, Massachusetts, and this is sort of the first, introduction of female literature books that we're going to be talking about here on this channel. This novel is about a little over 100 pages. Maybe not quite 100 pages, actually. 99 pages, so it's, exactly 99 pages. Pretty short to get through. Having said that, it does take some time to really digest and sort of get into the intentions and the different aspects of the characters. There was nothing particularly esoteric or really conspiratorial about this book. There are some references to sort of, dark, macabre things. The book features a lot of themes surrounding death and sort of romance as well, and a whole gambit of other things that we'll sort of get into. I really like this cover. So basically, to approach Ethan Frome, there will be spoilers in this book, in this video. So if you haven't read the novel, you might want to read the novel first and then check back up on this later. But probably by the time you get to it, you won't really remember too much of the spoilers. So basically, when you're approaching Ethan Frome, you're dealing with Edith Wharton was very heavily obsessed with Starkfield, Massachusetts. A lot of her stories took place there, and it's sort of a almost a winter wonderland, but there's sort of this weird way that the sun sort of reflects itself onto the landscape and the way that the sun sets at the end of each day, and you're sort of dealing with a form of desolation. It's not a real depressing sort of desolation. These characters don't necessarily hate their environment, but there is the element of man versus nature, I guess you could say. Her descriptions of winter in Starkfield, Massachusetts are quite beautiful. They're quite compelling, and that's one of the main things that I enjoyed about this novel. So basically, when you're approaching the Penguin Classic version, you're going to have to deal with a very, very extremely Marxist, leftist sort of introduction. I even wrote that Marxist intro. And basically the thesis of this particular author of the introduction, she was real focused on regionalism and what's known as local color theory, as well as social class and the alleged prejudice of Ethan Wharton. Now, why they have to constantly try to deconstruct authors and sort of put them in a modern lens, that is anyone's guess. That's sort of the postmodern agenda, right? Is to look back on old authors and apply modern concepts onto them forcibly, which really makes no sense. But anyway, you don't have to pay too much attention to the intro. But having said that, when you're approaching Ethan Frome, you can definitely approach it or sort of analyze it through the, I wouldn't say a Marxist context, but you could definitely sort of put it in sort of a feminist social context. And there is maybe some elements of Marxist analysis that you could apply to it. We'll talk a little bit more about how you could do that towards the end. I don't recommend approaching anything through a Marxist or a feminist lens, but that's one way to at least put it in context, right? We sort of live in a Marxist, overly feminized society right now, sort of a leftist society, a woke society, I guess we could say. So that's one way to sort of at least have the literature, the deeper meanings of the literature in your peripheral. Doesn't mean you have to use Marxist or feminist criticism on your favorite works, but when you're having a conversation with somebody else, especially if they're in academia, you will come across a lot of feminist and sort of Marxist criticism of these great authors. So it's good to kind of know how to argue your way out of that, so to speak. Kind of want to go grab my vape. 1 second, guys. It's actually right here. Didn't have to go too far. So the novel opens up through, I forgot who exactly the narrator is. It's not one of the main characters. It's more like one of the other family peripheral characters. But it says here, I had this story bit by bit from various people, and as generally happens in such cases, each time was a different story. So before I get into this, let me tell you a little bit about the plot that would probably be helpful, right? So basically, there's this guy named Ethan Frome. He's a little bit mysterious. He's got some skeletons in his closet. His wife is sort of taken ill, but she's also kind of a hypochondriac. We sort of get the sense that in some ways she's not a reliable character. In some ways, not that she's a bad character, but we're a little bit unsure of what her actual condition is and how much independence does this woman actually have. So Ethan Frome is kind of the mysterious guy that lives in Starkville, Massachusetts. He takes care of his sickly wife, and they sort of start having other individuals come to sort of help him lessen the load of having to take care of his wife. And the second main protagonist, in addition to Ethan Frome, ends up being a woman. What's her name here? It's Xena. His wife Xena is Ethan Frome's wife. Her name is Xena, and then I think her name is Caddy. Xena's cousin Caddy comes to take care of Ethan Frome's wife. And I think you guys can kind of guess where this is going. Ethan Frome has been taking care of his wife for quite some time. He's kind of become disillusioned. They're not really in love. And there's a lot of other different levels of symbolism that sort of come up here as far as the romance and the sort of the love affair between Ethan and his wife that has kind of long burned out, right? But the sort of the young, vivacious cousin, Caddy, I believe her name is, we'll confirm her name in a minute here. Mattie, I think her name is Mattie. What the hell is wrong with me? Yeah, Mattie. Mattie Silver, Xena's cousin, comes to help her, and Ethan becomes fond of her. So basically, Ethan Frome starts developing a very slow burn romance with his wife's cousin. So it's slightly maybe incestual, not exactly, but it's kind of like if her sister came and he started having a crush on her sister, right? Just a little bit weird, right? But Ethan Frome is an interesting character because we kind of feel for him. We feel the desolation of the Starkville, Massachusetts winters. We sort of feel the drudgery, the monotony of his job. He basically takes care of his wife and takes care of the horses on the farm and, does that whole thing. And then, so we're sort of rooting for him in a way when Mattie sort of comes into the picture because, like I said, Ethan Frome's wife, Xena, is not really the most likable character, even though she's decrepit, she's ill, and, all the while her husband is sort of developing feelings for her own cousin. We're still kind of on the side of Ethan Frome for whatever reason. So it says here, if you know Starkville, Massachusetts, you know the post office. If you know the post office, you must have seen Ethan Frome drive up to it, drop the reins on his hollow-backed bay, I guess that's a horse, and drag himself across the brick pavement to the white colonnade, and you must have asked who he was. So right off the bat, we're sort of getting this idea that a lot of people are either thinking or sort of talking about Ethan Frome behind his back, right? In Starkville, though he was but the ruin of a man, it was not so much his great height that marked him, for the natives were easily singled out by their lank longitude from the stockier foreign breed. It was the careless, powerful look he had, in spite of a lameless checking each step like a jerk of a chain. There was something bleak and unapproachable in his face, and he was so stiffened and grizzled that I took him for an old man and was surprised to hear he was not more than 52. So basically, this is it's either a family member or another town's member. I can't remember who's actually sort of introducing the story, but we're sort of getting this secondhand account, sort of like an omnipresent narrator, right? And we do get some introspection and statements from the three main characters' point of view, that being Ethan Frome, his wife Xena, and her cousin Mattie. But in general, this book is written sort of from an outsider's perspective, which I think is helpful because it makes the characters' sort of intentions a little more reliable. If it was written in the first person from Ethan Frome, it would be a little bit too selfish. If it was written from the cousin's point of view, then it would definitely be a little too selfish because she's the one that's seducing you know, the sick woman's, her sick cousin's husband. So she probably wouldn't be the most reliable narrator. And then, of course, we have his wife, Xena, who is kind of embittered. She's kind of a bitter, old, decrepit woman. I'm not actually sure how old she is, but she might not be the most reliable narrator her own self because of the resentments that sort of unfold. So we sort of get these descriptions of, you know, the Starkfield, Massachusetts, the winter, sort of the drudgery of what's going on there. Everyone in Starkfield knew him and gave him a greeting tempered to his own grave mien. But his tacturity was respected, and was only on rare occasions that one of the older men of the place detained him for a word. When this happened, he would listen quietly, his blue eyes on the speaker's face, and answer in so low a tone that his words never reached me. So he's kind of like a guy that speaks very little unless he really has something to say profound, right? At the moment, Ethan Frome, after climbing to his seat, had leaned over to ensure himself of the security of a wooden box, also with a druggist's label on it, which he had placed in the back of his buggy. I saw his face as it probably looked when he thought himself alone. That man, touch 100, he looks as if he was dead and in hell now. So we sort of getting, we're getting this impression of the interpretation of how other people sort of analyze Ethan Frome. You know, he's been weathered and sort of beaten down by working on the farm his whole life. He looks older than he is. Somebody had to stay there and take care of the folks. There weren't ever anybody but Ethan. Fussed his father, then his mother, then his wife. So he was taking care of his elderly parents as well. So that's another reason that we kind of sympathize with Ethan Frome, right? Though Herman Gow developed the tale as far as his mental and moral reach permitted, there were perceptible gaps between his facts, and I had the sense that the deeper meaning of the story was in the gaps. So that's another way I highlighted this because guess he's been in Starkfield for too many winters. So that whole statement, I had the sense that the deeper meaning of the story was in the gaps. Now you can do one reading of this and sort of get the overall gambit of what Edith Wharton is getting at, but it definitely would take another rereading, perhaps a second and third, fourth rereading, to really fill in those gaps, because there's a lot of stuff that's happening in the plot and sort of the way that the story unfolds that doesn't seem important until you kind of approach it in hindsight and you say, oh, okay, now I know why these characters did these things, or now I know why she described such and such this way, right? So let's jump to the next most relevant annotation here. Ethan is known by, this is something I wrote on the top of my annotation right here. Ethan is known by Harmon and his community as a strange, mysterious figure, holding something back as the winter sort of overtakes his mood. And the winter is definitely sort of, I guess you could say, a metaphor or sort of a literary technique that alludes to the underlying anxieties, the underlying sadnesses of Ethan Frome. And we sort of feel isolated for Ethan, not only due to his circumstances, but also because of the sort of the desolate, cold winters that she's describing in this novel. Ethan Frome, ? But I've never even spoken to him. Why on earth should he put himself out for me? So there's this guy that somebody is saying that he should go ask Ethan for help, because Ethan's known as sort of somebody that's giving. You know, he took care of his parents and he helps the community. He can basically fix a lot of things. He helps people's horses. I have been told that Frome was poor and that he saw a mill and that the sawmill and the arid acres of his farm yielded scarcely enough to keep his household through the winter. But I had not supposed him to be in such a want as Harmon's words implied, and I expressed my wonder. So basically, there's a little back and forth of between this character that is sort of looking for a handout, but he's also wants to help Ethan in the process too. Let's see here. Ethan starts giving the narrator rides in a horse and sleigh to and from town. So we also get these descriptions, and that's sort of where the story begins, is between the conversations that take place on the horse and buggy ride between Ethan Frome's farm or his home into the city and the various places that they go. And it says here, Ethan never turned his face to mine or answered except in monosyllables the questions I put or such slight pleasantries as I ventured. He seemed a part of the mute melancholy landscape and incarnation of its frozen woe, with all that was warm and sentient in him fast bound below the surface, but there was nothing unfriendly in his silence. I simply felt that he lived in a depth of moral isolation too remote for casual access, and I had the sense that his loneliness was not merely the result of his personal plight, tragic as I guessed that to be, but had in it, as Harmon Gow had hinted, the profound accumulated cold of many Starkfield winters. Only once or twice was the distance between us bridged for a moment, and the glimpses thus gained confirmed my desire to know more. So this narrator that sort of starts out the story is trying to read Ethan Frome but having a lot of difficulty. Ethan Frome just kind of mumbles. He doesn't make eye contact. So what's actually going on with this guy here? Now, there is a little bit of a confusion in the time gap of, I'm assuming this part of the novel, the beginning, sort of starts out, I would say, obviously before the ending, right? But is this taking place way back before the events transpired, or is this taking place? I think the whole novel only takes place over the course of a couple of days, to my knowledge. But when you're actually reading it, it comes across as it could be like months or maybe even years. I hope that this incident might set up more direct communication between us. Frome was so simple and straightforward that I was sure his curiosity about the book was based on a genuine interest in the subject. So they're sort of talking about books and they're talking about book trading. Such taste and acquirements in a man of his condition made the contrast more poignant because his outer situation and his inner needs, and I hoped that the chance of giving expression to the latter might at least unseal his lips. But something in his past history or in his present way of living had apparently driven him too deeply into himself for any casual impulse to draw him back to his kind. At our next meeting, he made no allusion to the book, and our intercourse seemed fated to remain as negative and one-sided as if there had been no break in his reserve. So, almost a disturbed sort of melancholic character. But at the same time, like the narrator stated, he's not mean, he's not particularly rude, he's just kind of sitting in his own, I don't even know what you would say, his own secrets. He's got 6 skeletons in his closet. So on page 17, the story starts to kind of unfold here. Mattie Silver, Zena's cousin, comes to help her, and Ethan becomes fond of her. So the story moves rather quickly, but like I said in the beginning part of this video, there's a lot of little details, a lot of idiosyncrasies that you need to kind of pick up on. Zena always went to bed as soon as she had her supper, and the shutterless windows of the house were dark. A dead cucumber vine dangled from the porch like the crepe streamer tied to the door for a death. And the thought flashed before Ethan's brain, if it was there for Zena, then he had a distinct sight of his wife lying in her bedroom asleep, her mouth slightly open, her false teeth in a tumbler by the bed. So he's almost becoming morosely sort of turned off by his wife as the time goes on. You know, he still loves her. There does seem to be some love there, but his wife is no longer attractive. She's decrepit, and we get these pretty honest descriptions of a man that's sort of falling out of love. It's kind of tragic. It was Zena's habit when they came back late from the village to leave the key of the kitchen door onto the mat. Ethan stood there before the door, his head heavy with dreams, his arms still about Mattie. I don't know, I guess he had her arm around her. Matt, he began, not knowing what he meant to say. She slipped out of his hold without speaking, and he stooped down and felt for the key. It's not there, he said, straightening himself out with a tart. They strained their eyes at each other through the icy darkness. Such a thing had never happened before. Maybe she's forgotten it, Mattie said in a tremulous whisper, but both of them knew that it was not like Zena to forget. It might have fallen off into the snow, Mattie continued, after a pause during which they had stood intently listening. It must have been pushed off, he then said. He rejoiced in the same tone. Another wild thought tore through him. What if tramps had been here, What if? Again he listened, fancying he heard a distant sound in the house, when he felt in his pocket for a match, and kneeling down, passed its light slowly over the rough edges of snow about the doorstep. He was still kneeling with his eye, when his eyes, on a level with the lower panel of the door, caught a faint ray beneath it. Who would be stirring in that silent house? He held a step on the stairs, and again for an instant the thought of tramps tore through him. Then the door opened, and he saw his wife. Against the dark background of the kitchen, she stood up tall and angular, one hand drawing a quilted counterpane to her flat breast, while the other held a lamp. The light, on a level with her chin, drew out of the darkness her puckered throat and the projecting wrist of the hand that clutched the quilt, and deepened fantastically the hollows and prominence of her high-boned face under its ring of crimping pins. To Ethan, still in the rosy haze of his hour with Mattie, he had just gotten back from hanging out with Mattie, and his wife is kind of catching him in the act now. Still in the rosy haze of his hour with Mattie, the slight came with the intense precision of the last dream before waking. He felt as if he had never before known what his wife looked like. So what's actually taking place here is sort of, I think what she's getting at is, you know, he's seeing his wife through a different eye now. He's seeing his wife through a different lens. And she's sort of confusing not only us as readers, but also Ethan, because she's supposed to be decrepit and she's supposed to be kind of sick, but then she's up at night walking around with a lantern and all this kind of stuff. She's almost like an entity. She's like a weird kind of creature. Let's see here. Without answering, Ethan moved away toward the kitchen. As he did so, his glance crossed Mattie's, and he fancied that a fugitive warning gleamed through her lashes. The next moment they sank to her flushed cheeks, and she began to mount the stairs ahead of Zena. That's so. It is powerful cold down here, Ethan assented, and with the lowered head he went up in his wife's wake and followed her across the threshold of their room. So they're sort of, the relationship is strained, but it's also become bizarre under the circumstances, right? There's a lack of trust, but there's also sort of the idea that his wife, Zena, is much smarter than he's sort of giving her credit for, I think. Mattie Silver was the daughter of a cousin of Zenobia Frome's, who had inflamed his clan with mingled sentiments of envy and admiration by descending from the hills of Connecticut, where he had married a Stamford girl and succeeded to her father's thriving drug business. Just a little background on Zena, on Mattie there. Not too important. So page 35, Ethan questions love and attraction towards his wife. So that's kind of the precipice, sort of the breaking point of this novel, is the main character, Ethan Frome, facing his negligent love for his wife that he basically no longer has. He became suddenly conscious that he was looking at Mattie while Zena talked to him, and with an effort he turned his eyes to his wife. She sat opposite the window, and the pale light reflected from the banks of snow made her face look more than usually drawn and bloodless, sharpened the three-paneled creases before ear and cheek, and drew querulous lines from her thin nose to the corners of her mouth. Though she was but 7 years her husband's senior, and he was only 28, she was already an old woman. So we're getting this reiteration of this unattractive old woman that he's forced to kind of take care of. Ethan tried to say something befitting the occasion, but there was only one thought in his mind, the fact that for the first time since Mattie had come to live with them, Zena was to be away for a night. He wondered if the girl were thinking of it too. So he is planning on kind of cheating on his wife, right? And it doesn't go into any sexual descriptions or anything like that, but they're trying to get Zena out of the picture. She's kind of an obstacle to these characters, right? So moving on. What page is this here? Page 37. Ethan struggles to realize his mother's illness and now that of his wife. So we have a history of this Ethan Frome character who's been plagued by not only his wife's illness, but his parents' illness, particularly his mother. There, the silence had deepened about him year by year. Left alone after his father's accident to carry the burden of farm and mill, he had no time for convivial loiterings in the village. And that's partly why he's so isolated. That's why he's almost like this phantom character to everyone around him in the village, because he's so busy. He's so toiled by his kind of depressing home life. To carry the burden of farm and mill, he had no time for connoival loiterings in the village, and when his mother fell ill, the loneliness of the house grew more oppressive than that of the fields. His mother had been a talker in her day, but after her trouble, the sound of her voice was seldom heard, though she had not lost the power of speech. So is she kind of mumbling? Is she, maybe she's partly paralyzed or just kind of rambling in her illness? Let's see here. So a little bit of background about his parents here. Nothing too. There's a little part here that says perhaps it was the inevitable effect of life on the farm, or perhaps, as she sometimes said, it was because Ethan never listened. The charge was not wholly unfounded, but she spoke it. It was only to complain, and to complain of things not in his power to remedy, and to check a tendency of impatient retort. He had first formed the habit of not answering her, and finally of thinking of other things while she talked. So his wife Zena is kind of resenting Ethan as well, because he's not really listening to her. He's not really providing any kind of emotional comfort or strength for her. So there's some other stuff going on here. There's a character named Andrew Hale, who I think Ethan takes out a loan from, or something like that. So page 43, I wrote feelings of secrecy in the cold winterland, graveyards and death, etc. He passed by the graves on the knoll and turned his head to glance at one of the older headstones, which had interested him deeply as a boy because it bore his name. So we talked a little bit about the beginning of this video, how themes of death kind of reoccur. Themes of the macabre are definitely present in this novel. And there's a sort of references to the graveyard that he constantly passes by. And that's interesting because we'll talk a little bit more about the graveyard towards the end. But it's almost like the Frome, the idea of Ethan Frome is almost like the Walking Dead, because his relatives are at the graveyard and he constantly goes there and reads the headstones. And this character, Ethan Frome, is facing his own mortality in this sort of this dark winter wonderland, right? Let's see here. So the gravestone says, sacred to the memory of Ethan Frome and Endurance, his wife, who dwelled together in peace for 50 years. So like I'm assuming he's talking about his parents. But like I said, the that's almost I don't want to give away the ending just yet, but that's almost an allusion to kind of where the story is going. He used to think that 50 years sounded like a long time to live together, but now it seemed to him that they might pass in a flash. Then with a sudden dart of irony, he wondered if, when their turn came, the same epitaph would be written over him and Zena. So, okay, so he is looking at his parents' gravestones, and he's thinking about his own mortality. He's thinking about his own marriage, and he's almost imagining how fast the time is already passed within his own marriage and his own life. So then there is a scene, I think, where several scenes rather, where Ethan Frome's wife Zena is being taken care of by somebody else. She's getting various medical treatments and she's out of the house, and Mattie and Ethan start to really flirt back and forth. They're you know, like I said, nothing real overtly sexual or sensual. Well, I shouldn't say that. Nothing sexual, but there is a very sensual quality to sort of their flirting. They give each other a lot of eye contact. Their conversations become kind of erotic, in sort of a dry, humorous sort of way. Now he's talking a little bit about his wife again here, I believe. Okay, so there's something else that occurs here. Did I make a annotation of it? Anyway, I don't think I referenced it here, but I think I forgot to write it down. But there's like a jar of pickles, or like there's like a it's not a jar, but it's like a where is it? It's like a little glass, sort of like a high quality glass, I don't know what you would call it, an urn sort of, not an urn, but sort of a pickle jar, but it's like, what's that word I want to use? It's like in those old movies where it's like a water pitcher, but it's not for water. It's like a beautifully ornate pickle jar. And Xena and Ethan, not Xena, I mean Ethan and Mattie are kind of fooling around one night, and the pickle jar falls on the ground and breaks. And this is a very special item, a prized item to Xena that represents something to the effect of, it's a reference to sort of when she first met Ethan or something, or it has something to do with their marriage. And she does find out that somebody broke it, and they kind of concoct this whole story to sort of divert, Xena's anger and stuff like that. So page 55, Ethan still continues to fall for Mattie as he becomes disillusioned with his wife. Now, I wrote here, does Frome want his wife to die? Her words fell on his ear with a strange lock of wonder. He had often heard her pronounce them before. What if at last they were true? Turning her head at this, she answered solemnly, I'm a great deal sicker than you think. So, and then he says, her words fell on his ear with a strange shock of wonder. He had often heard her pronounce them before, but what if at last they were true? So is Edith Wharton basically telling us that Frome wants his wife to die? It's never really fully explained. Ethan's heart was jerking to and fro between two extremities of feeling, but for the moment, compassion prevailed. His wife looked so hard and lonely, sitting there in the darkness with such thoughts. So they're kind of talking about what the doctor has been saying to her. Ethan was aware that in regard to the important question of surgical intervention, the female opinion of the neighborhood was divided, some glorifying in the prestige conferred by operations, while others shunned them as inadequate. Ethan, from motives of economy, had always been glad that Xena was of the later fraction. I didn't need to have anybody tell me I was losing ground every day. Everybody but you could see it, and everybody in Betstridge knows about Dr. Buck. So Ethan Frome's wife Xena is basically accusing her husband of almost ignoring her illness, almost pretending like it doesn't exist. Wrath and dismay contended in Ethan. He had foreseen an immediate demand for money, but not a permanent drain on his scant resources. He no longer believed that Xena had told him of the supposed seriousness of her state. He saw in her expedition to Betteridge only a plot hatched between herself and her Pierce relations to foist on him the cost of a servant, and for the moment wrath predominated. So there's some tension between them, obviously. And the first scene of open anger between the couple in their sad 7 years together, and Ethan felt as if he had lost an irretrievable advantage in descending to the level of recrimination. But the practical problem was there and had to be dealt with. I haven't got the money to pay for a girl, Xena. You'd have to send her back. I can't do it. The doctor says it'll be my death if I go on slaving the way I've had to. He doesn't understand now I've stood as long as I have. So I think what's taking place here is Ethan's wife Xena wants to hire another woman because she's trying to get Mattie out of the picture, right? He heard her say all right in her quick step on the stairs when he shut the door and turned back into the room. His wife's attitude was unchanged, her face inexplorable, and he was seized with a despairing sense of his helplessness. You ain't going to do it, Xena? Do what? She admitted between flattened lips. Send Mattie away like this? I've never bargained to take her for life. So she's basically saying that she only wanted this Mattie character for a temporary time, and because she's related to Mattie, she kind of calls all the shots. She can get rid of Mattie whenever she wants to, right? And bring in a new servant. He continued with rising vehemence. You can't put her out of the house like a thief, a poor girl without friends or money. She's done her best for you, and she's got no place to go. You may forget she's your kin, but everybody else will remember you. If you do a thing like that, what do you suppose folks will say of you? Ethan looked at her with loathing. She was no longer the listless creature who had lived at his side in a state of sullen self-absorption, but in a mysterious alien presence, an evil energy secreted from the long years of silent brooding. It was the sense of his helplessness that sharpened his antipathy. There had never been anything in her that no one could appeal to. But as long as he could ignore and command, he had remained indifferent. Now she had mastered him, and he abhorred her. Mattie was her relation, not his. There were no means by which he could compel her to keep the girl under her roof. That's kind of like what I just said. All the long misery of his baffled past, of his youth of failure, hardship, and vain effort rose up in his soul in bitterness and seemed to take shape before him in the woman who at every turn had barred his way. She had taken everything else from him, and now she meant to take the one thing that made up for all the others. For a moment, such a flame of hate rose in him that he ran down his arm and clenched his fist against her. He took a wild step backward and then stopped. "You're not coming down?" he said in a bewildered voice. "No, I guess I'll lay down on the bed a little while," she answered mildly, and he turned and walked out of the room. So the tension is definitely starting to boil over, as you can see. Ethan sees his wife as this terrible obstacle that's in the way of his happiness, that's in the way of his love for Mattie. There is some guilt, that he's sort of feeling at the same time. All the while, he still felt as if he were kissing her and yet dying of thirst from her lips. "Ethan, what happened? Is Zena mad with me?" Her cry steadied him, though it deepened his wrath and pity. No, he assured her, "it's not that, but this new doctor has scared her about herself. She believes all they say the first time she sees them. And this one, she's told her she won't get well unless she lays up and don't do a thing about the house, not for months." So he's sort of, telling Mattie that his wife is sending her away. Oh, here's the pickle dish thing here. We found it. As he reached the door, he met Zena coming back into her room, her lips twitching with anger, a flush of excitement on her sallow face. The shawl had slipped from her shoulders and was dragging at her downtrodden heels, and in her hand she carried the fragments of the red pickle dish. So the pickle dish is red, so it's sort of like an urn, but I guess it's like a dish. The way she described it earlier didn't really make sense. "I'd like to know who done this," she said, looking sternly from Ethan to Mattie. So this is sort of a metaphor for the fact that his wife is now aware that Ethan is keeping a lot of secrets from her, and she suspects that Mattie is part of this secret. Somebody broke her red pickle dish. A lot of symbolism with the color red, obviously, that we could delve into. I think we'll skip that for now. There was no answer, and she continued in a trembling voice. "I went to get those powders I put away in Father's old spectacle case, top of the china closet where I keep the things I set store by, so folks shan't meddle with them." Her voice broke, and two small tears hung on her lashless lids and ran slowly down her cheeks. "I want to know who done this," she quavered. As at the challenge, Ethan turned back into the room and faced her. "I can't tell you then. The cat done it." "The cat?" "That's what I said." She looked at him hard and then turned her eyes to Mattie, who was carrying the dishpan to the table. "I'd like to know how the cat got into my china closet," she said. Chasing mice, I guess," Ethan rejoined. "That was a mouse around the kitchen all last evening." Zena continued to look from one to the other, but she emitted her small, strange laugh. "I knew the cat was a smart cat," she said in a high voice, "but I didn't know he was smart enough to pick up the pieces of my pickle dish and lay them edge to edge on the very shelf I had knocked them off of." So Zena's kind of playing along, but we definitely get the sense that she's not buying this whole story. And gathering up the bits of the broken glass, she went out of the room as if she carried a dead body. Ugh, very heavy stuff. When Ethan was called back to the farm by his father's illness, his mother gave him, for his own use, a small room behind the unattended best parlor. So I'm not sure if this is going back in time or if he's taking a break from his own farm to go watch over his father, because his parents are dead here. So by this time, I believe, because we just read the epitaph on the gravestone, right? Let's see here. So there is a letter that's written by Ethan that he plans to sort of give his wife Zena, confessing that he's going to leave her. He knew a case of a man over the mountain, a young fellow about his own age who had escaped from such a life of misery by going west with the girl he cared for. His wife had divorced him, and he had married the girl and proposed. Ethan had seen the couple the summer before at Shad's Falls, where they had come to visit relatives. They had a little girl with fair curls who wore a gold locket and was dressed like a princess. The deserted wife had not done badly either. Her husband had given her the farm, and she had managed to sell it, and with that the alimony, she started a lunchroom at the Betchbridge and bloomed into activity and importance. So there's another family that was from this area or somewhere near here that Ethan is sort of comparing himself to, and he's getting ideas, and he's sort of scratching his head saying, hey, this guy did it, and this woman, you know, ended up being okay, so maybe I should do it too. And the sheet of paper, he began to write on a small sheet of paper from the drawer. Zena, I've done all I could do for you. I don't see it has been any use. I don't blame you, nor do I blame myself. Maybe both of us will do better separate. I'm going to try my luck west, and you can sell the farm and mill and keep the money. So he doesn't actually follow through with this, obviously. With the sudden perception of the point to which his madness had carried him, the madness fell, and he saw his life before him as it was. He was a poor man, the husband of a sickly woman who his desertion would leave him alone and destitute. And even if he had the heart to desert her, he could have done so only by deceiving two kindly people who had pitied him. He turned and walked slowly back to the farm. So he talks himself out of doing this, right? Partly it's due to a conversation that he had with Mrs. Hale and also Mattie. And so, like I said, the character Ethan Frome is cold-hearted, but at the same time, he's got a pretty prevalent conscience. He's not, you know, that bad of a guy, and that's kind of why we're rooting for him. Even though he's planning to leave to desert his elderly sick wife, even though he's romanticizing her young cousin Zena, we kind of feel for this guy, right? Ethan's conscience versus his desires. I wrote that in the annotation. That's kind of what we're dealing with in this entire novel, is a man's battle with his conscience, right? Ethan, looking slowly about the kitchen, we're sort of getting to the tail end of the novel here, and said to himself with a shudder that in a few hours he would be returning to it alone. Then the sense of unreality overcame him once more, and he could not bring himself to believe that Mattie stood there for the last time before him. So Mattie's getting ready to leave. Page 85, we get a background of Ethan and Mattie's first meeting, their desires, love, and seduction. Okay, so basically, let me try to explain this to you guys here. I believe this is the final chapter. Let me just double check. Okay, it's not the final chapter, but it's the last chapter sort of before the epilogue. See if I can retrace the events here. So we just read that part about he's facing the reality that Mattie's going to be going away. He's not going to be able to really keep Mattie, right? So his wife Zena is upstairs, and Ethan and Mattie sort of concoct this plan to go out riding on the carriage, right? Says, come on, he said almost gaily, opening the door and putting her bag into the sleigh. He sprang to his seat and bent over to tug the rug about her as she slipped into place at his side. Now then, go along, he said with a shake of his reins that sent the sorrel placidly jogging down the hill. We got lots of time for a good ride, Mattie cried, seeking her hand beneath the fur and pressing it in his. His face tingled and he felt dizzy, as if he had stopped at the Starkfield saloon on a 0 day for a drink. At the gate, instead of making for Starkfield, he turns the sorrel to the right up the Bettsbridge Road. Mattie sat silent, giving no signs of surprise, but after a moment she said, are you going round by Shallow Pond? So we're sort of diverting the journey. I think he was supposed to take her home or take her out of there, but he's not going to. He laughed and answered, I knew you'd know. She drew closer under the bearskin so that looking sideways around his coat sleeve, he could just catch the tip of her nose and a blown brown wave of hair. They drove slowly up the road between fields glistening under the pale sun, and then went to the right down a lane edged with spruce and larch. Ethan drove on in silence till they reached a part of the wood where the pines were more widely spaced. Then he drew up and helped Mattie to get out of the sleigh. They passed between their aromatic trunks, the snow breaking crisply under their feet, till they came to a small sheet of water with steep wooded sides. So basically they're just kind of riding around in the country. But then they start speeding. Let's see here. I could go down this coast with my eyes tied, and she laughed with him if she liked his audacity. Nevertheless, he sat still for a moment, straining his eye down the long hill, for it was the most confusing hour of the evening, the hour when the last clearness from the upper sky has merged with the rising night in a blur that disguises landmarks and falsifies distances. So there's a little bit of foreshadowing there of what's about to occur. Now, he cried. The sled started with a bound, and they flew on through the dusk, gathering smoothness and speed as they went, with the hollow night opening out below them and the air singing by like an organ. Don't be scared, Mattie cried exultantly as they spun safely past it and flew down the second slope. And when they reached the level ground beyond and the speed of the sled began to slacken, he heard her give a little laugh of glee. They sprang off and started to walk back up the hill. Ethan dragged the sled with one hand and passed the other through Mattie's arm. Were you scared I'd run you into the elm? He asked with a boyish laugh. I told you I was never scared with you, she answered. The strange exaltation of his mood had brought on one of his rare fits of boastfulness. It is a tricky place, though. The least swerve and we'd never have come up again, but I can measure distances to a hair's breadth. She murmured, I always say you've got the surest eye. Deep silence had fallen within the starkest dusk, and they leaned on each other without speaking. But at every step of their climb, Ethan said to himself, it's the last time we'll ever walk together. So Ethan and Mattie are facing the reality of being separated, which they can't really take. They can't emotionally handle it. They mounted slowly to the top of the hill. When they were abreast of the church, he stooped his head to her to ask, are you tired? And she answered, breathing quickly, it was splendid. With the pressure of his arm, he guided her toward the Norway spruces. I guess this sled must be Ned Hale's. Anyhow, I'll leave it where I found it. He drew the sled up to the Varnum gate and rested across against the fence. So he sort of faces his life again. The words were like fragments torn from his art. With them came the hated vision of the house he was going back to, of the stairs he would have to go up to every night, of the woman who would wait for him there, and the sweetness of Mattie's avowal, the wild wonder of knowing at last that all that had happened to him had happened to her too, made the other vision more abhorrent and the other life more tolerable to return to. Okay, so now his wife is sort of upstairs sleeping, and he goes out on another ride with Mattie here. Her somber violence constrained him. She seemed to have the embodiment, an instrument of fate. He pulled the sled out, blinking like a night bird, as he passed from the shade of the spruces into the transparent dusk of the open. The slope below them was deserted. All Starkfield was at supper, not a figure crossed the open space before the church. He took his seat on the sled, and Mattie instantly placed herself in front of him. Her hat had fallen into the snow, and his lips were in her hair. He stretched out his legs, drove his heels into the road to keep the sled from slipping forward, and bent her head back between his hands. Then suddenly he sprung up again. Get up, he ordered her. It was the tone she had always needed, but she cowered down in her seat, repeating vehemently, no, no, no. And then he says, get up. Why? I want to sit in front. No, you can... how can you steer in front? I don't have to. We'll follow the track. As they took wing for this, it seemed to him that they were flying indeed, flying far up into the cloudy night, with Starkfield immeasurably below them, falling away like a speck in space. Then the big elm shot up ahead, lying in wait for them at the bend of the road, and he said between his teeth, we can fetch it. I know we can fetch it. As they flew toward the tree, Mattie pressed her arms together, and her blood seemed to be in his veins. Once or twice the sled swerved a little under them. He slanted his body to keep it headed for the elm, repeating to himself again and again, I know we can fetch it. The little phrase that she had spoken ran through his head and danced before him on the air. The big tree loomed bigger and closer, and they bore down on it. He thought, it's waiting for us. It seems to know. But suddenly his wife's face, with twisted monstrous lineaments, thrust itself between him and his goal, and he made an instinctive movement to brush it aside. The sled swerved in response, but he righted it again, kept it straight, and drove down on the black projecting mass. There was a last instant when the air shot past him like millions of fiery wires, and then the elm. The sky was still thick, but looking straight up, he saw a single star and tried vaguely to reckon whether it was Sirius or whether it was Sirius. That's a capital, Sirius. I guess that's a astrological sign, maybe. The effort tired him too much, and he closed his heavy lids and thought he would sleep. The stillness was so profound that he heard a little animal twittering somewhere between by under the snow. It made a small frightened sheep like a field mouse, and he wondered languidly if it were hurt. Then he understood that it must be pain so excruciating that he seemed mysteriously to feel it shooting through his own body. He tried in vain to roll over in the direction of the sound and stretch his left arm out across the snow. But he continued to finger about cautiously with his left hand, thinking he might get hold of the little creature and help it. And all at once he knew that the soft thing he had touched was Mattie's hair, and that his hand was on her face. He dragged himself to his knees, and the monstrous load on him moving with him as he moved, and his hand went over and over his face, and he felt that the twittering came from her lips. He got his face down close to her with his ear to hers and mouth, and in the darkness he saw her eyes open and heard her say his name. "Oh, Matt, I thought we'd fetched it," he moaned, and far off up the hill he heard the sorrel whinny and thought, I ought to be getting him his feed. So what actually, let me try to put this in context for you guys. I'm not actually quite sure if he was trying to, what it sounds like is that him and Mattie, I'm not sure if it was mutual on her part or not, but him and Mattie were attempting to kill themselves is what it kind of sounds like, right? Attempting to kill themselves. They were driving in the middle of the night on a sleigh and they tried to hit a tree, but at some point in time, right, Ethan got a vision of his wife Zena, and I think he maybe reconsidered or something, but it didn't really quite work. So they're both still alive, right? And it's almost like they were dying, right? That's sort of where the last chapter ends, and then there's a little epilogue. And this is kind of the last part of the video here. We'll talk about what happened. The querulous drone ceases. Now we're going way ahead in time here, back to the omnipresent narrator. The querulous drone ceased as I entered Frome's kitchen, and of the two women sitting there, I could not tell which had been the speaker. So this omnipresent narrator went to the Ethan Frome farm, right, the house, and she kind of heard two women talking behind the door, and I guess she knocked on the door and the door opens. One of them, on my appearing, raised her tall, bony figure from her seat, not as if to welcome me, for she threw me no more than a brief glance of surprise, but simply to set about preparing the meal which Frome's absence had delayed. A slatternly calico wrapper hung from her shoulders, and the wisps of her thin gray hair were drawn away from a high forehead and fastened at the back of a broken comb. She had pale, opaque eyes which revealed nothing and reflected nothing, and her narrow lips were of the same sallow color as her face. The other woman was much smaller and slighter. She sat huddled in an armchair near the stove, and when I came in, she turned her head quickly toward me without the least corresponding movement of her body. Creepy, right? Zena, she's not talking about Zena. She's the narrator describing Mattie. If you guys understand what I'm getting at. Her hair was gray as her companions. Her face is bloodless and shriveled, but amber tinted, with swarthy shadows sharpening the nose and hollowing the temples. Under her shapeless dress, her body kept its limp immobility, and her dark eyes had the bright witch-like stare that disease of the spine often gives. So Mattie is now paralyzed. Isn't that just awful? It's cold here. The fire must be out, Frome said, glancing upon him apologetically as he followed me in. The tall woman who had moved away from us toward the dresser took no notice, but the other, from her cushioned niche, answered complainingly in a high, thin voice, "It's only just been made up this very minute. Zena fell asleep and slept ever so long." So then there's some sort of introspection by the omnipresent narrator. I used to go a good deal after the accident when I was first married, but after a while I got to think it made him feel worse to see us. Then one thing and another came in my own troubles, but I generally make out to drive over there round about New Year's, and once in the summer Only I always try to pick a day when Ethan's off somewheres. It's bad enough to see the two women sitting there, but his face, when he looks around that bare place, just kills me. You see, I can look back and call it upon his Mother's Day before their troubles. Let me just make sure I covered everything here. Here's the last paragraph here. She took off her spectacles again, leaning toward me across the bed, the bead work table cover, and went on with lowered voice. There was one day about a week after the incident when they all thought Mattie couldn't live. Well, I say it's a pity she did live. I said it right out to our minister once, and he was shocked at me, only he wasn't with me that morning when she first came to. And I say if she'd had died, Ethan might have lived. And the way they are now, I don't see there's much difference between the Fromes up at the farm and the Fromes down in the graveyard, except that down there they are all quiet and the women have to hold their tongues. So make of that what you will, but basically Ethan's plan backfired. You know, he was trying to either kill him and Mattie, but then somehow his conscience came back into the picture and he imagined his wife, and he didn't want to leave his wife stranded, but it was too late. They hit the tree and Mattie ended up paralyzed, and I think Ethan Frome is pretty decrepit himself, but he's basically now having to live with, you know, he's made his own bed and now he has to lie in it. His object of his love desire is now paralyzed. She sits at home all day, and Ethan now takes care of not only his decrepit wife but his decrepit love interest, the cousin of Xena, who was Mattie. So that's kind of Ethan Frome in a nutshell. Appreciate you guys hanging along for the ride. We did quite a bit of reading there to kind of put things in context. I hope, you know, the novel was interesting to you guys. I hope you guys will maybe pick up a copy of Ethan Frome. Like I said, it's not instant gratification. It would definitely take another rereading, which we might actually pursue, just to kind of try to master the story a little bit. There's a lot of gaps in my memory of the plot. But we did have quite a bit of symbolism there. You know, we have the stark winter wasteland of Massachusetts, Starkfield, you know, a rather stark place. But we also have sort of the events that transpire. We have the pickle dish, the red pickle dish that gets broken. So that's sort of a metaphor, or perhaps an allusion to the brokenness between the marriage of Ethan and Xena. And then, of course, we have the love interest, Mattie, who kind of comes into the picture and kind of inadvertently seduces Ethan. You know, it's not like she really did it on purpose. And she was not a unlikable character. She was a rather neutral character. And, you know, by the end, we sort of get the illusion of death is what Edith Wharton leaves us with. She says here, and I say if Mattie had died, Ethan might have lived. And what she means by that is, I'm not exactly sure what she means by that exactly, but I guess she's basically saying that it would have been better if Mattie had died, because then at least Ethan could have moved on. Now he's having to live with his love interest, who's now paralyzed. I don't see there's much difference between the Fromes up at the farm and the Fromes down in the graveyard, except that down there they are all quiet and the women have to hold their tongues. So I wrote a giant question mark at the bottom of the annotation there, because there's a lot of different sort of, you know, ways you can kind of interpret that ending. But what is Ethan Wharton trying to say? You know, is she making a case, sort of a social case for disability? Is she making a social case for marriages? Is she making a social commentary on you know, middle-class farm workers that sort of struggle with, you know, internal family conflict? There's a lot of different ways you can interpret it, and I think that's why they sort of had the Marxist intro in the beginning, because by the end of the novel, we're sort of dealing with two decrepit women that are still sort of in sort of under the care and the control, I guess, of the man. And the man, by his own selfish pursuits, is now living with his own sin. You know, he's living with his own tragedy that he's almost kind of created inadvertently. So let me know your thoughts and comments down below. If you've got any other recommendations from Edith Wharton, please let me know. We do have The Age of Innocence up here. by Edith Wharton that we're going to probably get our eyes and ears into. I do like Edith Wharton. She's a pretty interesting writer. I wouldn't say Ethan Frome was my favorite novel, but it's pretty compelling, and I think if I read it again, it might become one of my top favorites. So I think that's it for now, folks, and we'll talk to you guys real soon.